So the final film we're going to review this month is Palm Springs. And Jim, why don't you tell us a little bit about this film?
So yes, Palm Springs. So our lead here is Andy Samberg, and he is playing Niles, who is a guest at a wedding. And we very quickly learn that basically we've got a bit of a Groundhog Day situation here, and he has been living the day of this wedding, at which he's a guest. He's there with his girlfriend, over and over, and obviously that has taken a bit of a toll on him, but he's been living this day again and again, and basically he starts to form an attachment with Sarah, played by Cristin Milioti, and quite early on, basically through some sort of, supernatural event, she also starts to begin experiencing this day over and over. And similar to kind of other films that have used this sort of concept before, basically, if they go to sleep or if they die at any point during this period, they will wake up again and start the day completely anew. There's various people in supporting roles. I think the most notable supporting role is probably going to be J.K. Simmons as another character who's actually stuck in this loop as well. And basically it just follows that. These two developing a bond, living this day over and over, kind of the emotional effect this has on them and how they then look and reflect upon their lives and where they go from there. I think I'll leave it at that. The setup is kind of simple, and I think it's probably best to kind of like let it play out and you get to know the characters in the film. But basically that is the premise. It's one that will be familiar to anybody who has watched Groundhog Day. I think it's the most obvious touchstone. But I think the way it goes about presenting the characters is quite interesting, and the way that it differs from films that have done similar things. I got a lot out of it, but I'm interested to see what other folk thought about it.
I mean, I would just like to ask but my own film knowledge about this, apart from Groundhog Day, this idea, which I really love Groundhog Day, and I thought that was a really unique concept, and if there was a film before that came I didn't know, that would have been because of my, knowledge, not like my lack of knowledge about film history at the time when seeing it. But supposedly there's been a couple films since then, apart from this, that, has used this concept. To me, it seems that's become like this trope. And in a weird way, I wondered if there could have been a nod to that in some capacity, because I just didn't, it seems so uniquely one film, and yet we're now kind of running with it. Like, oh yeah, you've seen Groundhog Day, so you get it. I guess from an overall concept that kind of annoyed me a bit, but otherwise, I really like Andy Samberg. I've always been obsessed with SNL and Lonely Island and stuff like that. So I've enjoyed those over the years. So was it funny? Yeah, it was quite cute, and it was nice, and it was like having these two people dealing with that situation. It was nice to go back to that idea of the everyday, because I've seen Groundhog Day enough. But I guess that would be my overall impression, is that it's definitely taking on an idea from another film, but maybe not commenting enough on that. I don't know what you guys think.
To pick up on that tradition, I think I'd go so far to say we're in a golden age for time loop stories, for time loop narratives.
Yeah.
We've got TV shows like Russian Doll, films like Happy Death Day, Edge of Tomorrow, and in video games, we've got Outer Wilds, Deathloop is coming out soon, Minute. These are all time loop stories that have come out in the past few years. And I think Palm Springs is a really interesting, sort of self-aware addition to that tradition. I think it knows enough about it. The film knows that the audience knows what the deal is with time loops. That it doesn't have to explain it too much. It can rely on these previous films. It can rely on Groundhog Day and say, you get the idea. We're stuck doing the same day again. This time it's at a wedding. This time it's going to be a romantic comedy. And I thought that worked really well. I think it had a really good cohesion of theme with that narrative conceit, with that time loop conceit.
I do kind of agree with Amanda on the kind of Groundhog Day-esque film gimmick getting a bit old hat. I think that the more redeemable aspect of Palm Springs is that, unlike films like Happy Death Day and the sequel, I think, which was only out last year, is a very on the nose reference to Groundhog Day. It's very much, here's Groundhog Day, but we're going to genre flip it and make it, it still has its own spin on it. Not don't get me wrong, but with this one, the time loop thing kind of edges a bit more into the background as the story develops and things become more into the focus. Where I think another film that kind of played on the time loop saga in modern film, I don't know if anyone's seen the film Triangle that was out, I don't know if it was near 2010, I can't really remember.
Oh yeah.
That was kind of one that played about that formula a bit as well. But I feel like, much like Palm Springs, it kind of, it didn't put too much emphasis on this kind of becoming the core of the entire film. That became a lot more at play. I think films such as Happy Death Day was made to be kind of a nostalgic kind of bounce back from Groundhog Day to kind of almost in a tribute kind of fashion. I don't feel that was the same with Palm Springs. I think that it used that kind of age-old trope to its advantage in terms of narrative, but I think that it kind of let other plot points kind of take hold as the film kind of progresses.
I think it's interesting. So I can't speak to Happy Death Day because I've not seen that, but I think something that I appreciate about the film and the way it uses this device, I think, is the way. So basically, whenever this device happens, right, it's used for the personal growth of a character in some sense, right? And obviously, Bill Murray's character in Groundhog Day, he starts off as an asshole. He learns to not be an asshole, and then there's aspects to Edge of Tomorrow as well, where like the Tom Cruise character has growth to him as well. I think what I appreciated about this a little bit is, and it plays partially into the setting, perhaps, but mainly the journey that Samberg's character, Niles, goes on in particular. And it's not a case of that he starts off as, an asshole and learns not to be. It's essentially that he's kind of given up. And when you look at it in terms of his station in life and his attitude to things, there is a certain kind of poetry to the idea that he is living the same day over and over, because arguably he and the other character, Sarah, are in a situation where they are effectively, even outside that, before they came to this wedding, living the same day over and over, in the sense that they can't progress, and maybe they are repeating some personal mistakes, sure, but basically their circumstances are such that they can't really advance from that. And I think when you then contrast that with, there's a lot of very funny stuff here with J.K. Simmons as well, right? Who plays someone who's also stuck in this time loop. It's very much a short role. It's not a big thing, but I think it is kind of crucial to balancing the ideas of the film, because then when you look at the way he has reacted to it, and without giving anything away, I'm not gonna go into details about it, and how he has come to deal with this scenario, let's say, that I think highlights the contrast between that and Samberg's character in terms of what you can find solace in, and that to me lends a little bit more weight to the developing connection between Cristin Milioti's character and his. So yes, it is a device which has been used before. It's maybe not nodding to it constantly, but I actually think the way it used it for its characters is actually quite interesting. And I think that Andy Samberg's performance in this is actually really quite good. He's a funny guy, and I think he's somebody who, there's something about his delivery I just connect with very well in terms of being able to find it funny, but I think he's actually got some really good weight behind this performance as well. I really got into it. Is it a perfect film? No, and I don't think it's. I'm maybe giving it a bit too much credit for its depth here in what I'm saying, but I do think. I do think there is more to it, I think, and I appreciated that character trajectory it went for and how it used the central kind of like high concept device to communicate that.
Yeah, I'm gonna give it maybe again more depth than it needs. But I read it as being about the search for meaning and embracing love as a source of meaning amidst this meaninglessness of life and existence. Like you say, at the start of the film, Andy Samberg is he's a nihilist, his life is meaningless because his life is meaningless. He's stuck in a time loop where his actions do not have consequences. And I think that time loop, that narrative conceit, helped bring in that sense of meaninglessness, which goes towards this theme of finding love as a source of meaning. Because I think you'd be hard-pressed to establish the meaninglessness of life in general in this kind of 90-minute film without spending a lot of time on it. But the time loop is a shortcut to get to that point.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a very kooky film. It kind of blends a lot of genres together, but at the same time, it never really sort of radiates eccentricity that you'd expect from the collision between the kind of comedy, fantasy, romance hybrid. I think, if anything, it's quite admirable for the way it plays within kind of the philosophical narrative conventions at the heart of it. Like, a lot of comedies, particularly darker ones, experiment with kind of nihilism and consequentialist theories in a way. And but I think, and this is down to, I think, Andy Serra's screenplay and Max Barbaco's direction, and very much a balance of merit. It's difficult to credit one more than the other. It's a film that kind of manages to incorporate a pretty in-depth debate in the way that existentialist debate, in the way it doesn't really distort and change the tone. It doesn't really have that sort of narrative formula we see a lot, where it starts off really light and descends pretty rapidly into the abyss. We kind of have a plot centered around people forced to relive the same day with it moving forward with their lives. But it sways on top of this kind of idyllic holiday resort, and it's like, well, yeah, it's not great, but at least it's happening in Palm Springs of all places. So there's this kind of refreshing optimism behind the chaos that's unfolding. So I think that I found it, I wouldn't say it's a perfect film. I found it quite refreshing in the way that it kind of took on the time loop trope and the kind of philosophical comedy and fantasy and made it its own in a way. I think that, and especially it didn't have a lot of time to really go into heavy detail with all of that, but I think the way that it channeled it through within the characters, and I think that the characters were all perfectly cast. It's always a pleasure to see like J.K. Simmons. I think that he's one of the most consistently versatile actors, and he's a joy to watch in anything. Andy Samberg, he's a great comedic actor. I think, most notably, I think, from Brooklyn Nine-Nine now, and you've got Cristin, Milioti, who's had her fair share of kind of American sitcom guest appearances, and I think especially the more kind of Samberg and Milioti bounce off each other with ease in this film, I think they really make it quite easy to watch.
Yeah, I mean, I hear all that, and I think I haven't seen Happy Death Day either, and didn't know we were kind of going through a golden era of time loop films. But I mean, when you're saying it's dealing with the mindlessness of like the boringness of every day and stuff like that, and it's a rom-com, I mean, again, it goes back to this. Groundhog Day essentially did that itself, and it was and so it just. It is interesting, and I don't know if Andy Samberg did his greatest, acting performance here. I mean, there were a couple of times where I felt very, like, oh, like that wasn't, he was trying to be serious there, and it didn't really work. I mean, he's very funny. I laughed out loud. It was interesting to take two other characters with you in that time loop, so that was unique and different. I guess I just didn't. Maybe I had higher expectations on it or something. It just didn't. It didn't seem like it paid homage enough to its original sort of inspiration, as well as like deliver something that was any more exciting other than it was in a warmer climate.
I think it's interesting, like, and I agree. For me, it's not quite up there with Groundhog Day. Like, it's the old thing. Like, if you only had the kind of the original negatives for each film, that was the last thing of it in existence, and I need to save one from a burning house, and I could only do one, I'd probably do Groundhog Day, right? But having said that, I do think there is something here about. I think this will speak to different generations differently, right? And I think particularly people who are maybe like, quite a bit younger than I am, I think will probably connect more with the feeling that Samberg manages to generate in this film than they would in something like Groundhog Day. And that's not to say they won't connect with Groundhog Day. It's more kind of like the emotional arc that he has in this film, I think, speaks to the sort of group I'm talking about here. And they capture. So for me, I think it's more a case of it's not that. For me, it's not that other films have done it better, although sure, some have, but it's more the journey it takes its character on is a little bit different. And I think what I liked about it is I felt like the time loop aspect of that played into that. Because it's taken this kind of ridiculous fantasy concept and it's used that to evoke a feeling about how that character, or those characters, if we look at Cristin Milioti's as well, feel about their position in life and where they are in relation to what society expects of them, I would say. So in that sense, I think it's quite. I think it's basically it's a light romantic comedy, but I think it's got enough smarts to it to give it a little bit more, to make it a little bit more memorable. Because there's a lot of skilled comedic actors out there, skilled physical comedic actors, skilled verbal comedic actors. It'd be very easy to make a film that is quite funny, and I think they've done that here. It's a funny film to me. I laughed quite a bit watching it, but I do think it's got this melancholic edge that it manages to blend in pretty well. And I think that's something that Steph said, which I would agree with. It doesn't feel like there's a sharp left turn in tone at any point. There are points where it goes a little bit more somber, introspective, or it becomes a little bit more serious. But for me, it moved in and out of that and some of the more absurdist stuff and the more overtly funny stuff quite well. And I think that's down to the performances mainly. Undoubtedly a bit of the direction also. But I think the way it's balanced all those tones and heightened the emotional feeling that it wants to generate through this time loop device. To me, it worked. It worked really pretty well, I think, at doing that.
The comedy for me as well was quite fresh and quite different. I mean, it's produced by The Lonely Island, Andy Samberg's comedy trio, and you can feel their sort of absurdist, self-aware stamp on the comedy. I'm a big fan of The Lonely Island. I really love Popstar, Never Stop, Never Stopping. And I really it really clicked with me.
Well, it's certainly funny, and we certainly think you should check it out. And you can tell us whether or not you like this one as much as Groundhog Day. And it will come out on the 9th of April on Amazon Prime. So look out for that.